There's a famous Henry Kissinger quote, which apparently he didn't even write.
Control oil, and you control nations. Control food, and you control people.
Regardless of who wrote it, it's a succinct way to explain what's happening in several nations on different timescales, but for all the same reason and orchestrated by the same people.
Your Royal Highnesses, Your Excellencies, Lords, Ladies and Gentlemen, please welcome His Royal Highness.
Where am I complicit in a war against the earth?
Indian Point Power Plant, they began talking that night about violence.
There is an uncertain future for a strategically important island nation where economic crisis has now been followed by political upheaval.
I want you to stay angry. I want you to stay frustrated.
Who cares if our children and grandchildren curse us?
With a growing global population creating ever-increasing demand on the planet's finite resources, the most emitting and polluting industries. They include energy, agriculture.
Our planet has been wounded by our actions.
I say no, you say nukes. No, no. I say no, you say nukes. No, no.
A new industrial revolution.
Africa, if everybody's raising living standards to the point where everybody's got a car and everybody's got air conditioning and everybody's got a big house, well, the planet will boil over.
I pray that heaven may bestow its choicest blessings on your city, that the devastations of war in which you found it may soon be without a trace, that a well-regulated and beneficial commerce may enrichen your citizens, and that your state, at present the seat of the empire, may set such examples of wisdom and liberality as shall have a tendency to strengthen and give permanency to the Union at home, and credit and respectability to it abroad.
In 1785, George Washington wrote to the mayor of New York City, James Duane. He referred to New York as the seat of the empire, which later became known as the Empire State. The role of New York, and specifically the Hudson Valley, cannot be understated in the fight for the soul of America and the course of world history. It was here that the most pivotal point in the American Revolution against British rule took place. Benedict Arnold had been considered a patriot and war hero, playing key roles in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga and the Battle of Saratoga. For this reason, George Washington entrusted Arnold with the command of West Point, a military outpost located in a place of tremendous geographic and strategic importance. Positioned on a narrow S-curve of the Hudson River, it was a natural choke point for supply and military ships trying to move up and down the river. It was also the main artery between New England and the southern colonies. If the British controlled the Hudson, they could split the colonies in two, isolating New England and crushing the rebellion geographically. George Washington considered it the key to the continent. For the American Revolution, West Point was the linchpin of American military strategy in the Northeast. Its loss could have been catastrophic, which is why Arnold's betrayal was so devastating to George Washington. Someone who he considered a great American patriot had almost sabotaged the battle against empire from within. But the revolution was won, and America burst onto the world stage, bringing a new hope to mankind. The economy of America was profoundly different from that of Britain's. Alexander Hamilton believed that a strong industrial economy built through government-backed infrastructure, manufacturing, and finance, was essential to true national independence. In his 1791 Report on Manufactures, he argued for protective tariffs, subsidies, and internal improvements to nurture domestic industry. He also established the first bank of the United States to stabilize currency and extend credit for development, the antithesis of Wall Street speculation. The defining factor of the American system of economy was its emphasis on using the power of the federal government to promote national economic development through internal improvements, protective tariffs, and a strong national bank. Unlike laissez-faire capitalism or colonial free trade models, the American system aimed to build a self-sufficient, industrialized nation by directing credit into infrastructure, manufacturing, and scientific progress, ensuring that economic growth served the general welfare rather than speculative or foreign interests. The American system was, in many ways, an energy revolution of the sovereign nation against the British East India Company, which colonized the world by keeping it underdeveloped. The American story taps into an ethos and resonates with those of moral conviction. An army of scrappy continentals and militia stood up to Goliath and won. It has only been a quarter of a millennia since we played David, but now we seem to be filling the role of Goliath himself. How did we get here? How did America come to embody the monster we once fought?
Hey everyone, I'm here today to tell you how we can make America healthy again.
You may know him as the former U.S. presidential candidate who started as a Democrat, later switching to independent, and eventually endorsing Donald Trump, who now touts a program to make America healthy again.
To transform our nation's food, fitness, air, water, soil, and medicine. Our big priority will be...
According to his public persona, Robert Kennedy, Bobby Jr., has become America's notorious health crusader, a David fighting Goliath on behalf of the common people, armed only with the truth and his famous Kennedy name as his arsenal. But what was RFK Jr. doing before running for the highest office of the United States? During the last election, not a single journalist asked him about the legal case that was considered a capstone of his career.
Pesticide residues out of our food.
As a young man, Kennedy had a major fall from grace when he was caught with heroin and sentenced to community service. He fulfilled his sentence by volunteering for the litigious environmental organization, Natural Resources Defense Council. Soon after, he volunteered for the Hudson River Fishermen's Association. In 1985, he became their senior attorney, and by 1986, the organization renamed themselves Riverkeeper.
I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr. For the last 14 years, I've been the chief prosecuting attorney for the Hudson Riverkeeper.
What began as a crusade to save fish would end in a victory that cost thousands of working people their jobs and millions their energy security.
One of the first great battles of the environmental movement in this country was the fight over the Indian Point power plant. This plant was one of the first commercial reactors in the country, and some saltwater fishermen from Long Island Sound and some Hudson River fishermen discovered in the early 60s that the intake valves were killing sometimes millions of fish a day.
For over 60 years, the Indian Point nuclear power plant stood along the banks of the Hudson River, a quiet sentinel delivering clean, reliable energy to New York City and the Hudson Valley. But from the moment its turbines began to spin, it faced unrelenting opposition. Environmental groups mounted a decades-long campaign, not just against the plant's safety, but against its very existence. On April 30th, 2021, their efforts prevailed. Indian Point was permanently shut down. but the data told a different story. Federal assessments showed that, with proper upkeep, Indian Point could have continued supplying clean energy to millions for decades longer. In 2021, Indian Point's final reactor powered down, and Buchanan held a funeral, not just for a plant, but for the industrial heart of a middle-class community that had long depended on it for stability, purpose, and a future.
There's 1,000 helmets, yellow helmets, and that represents the loss of 1,000 jobs.
This is a sad day. Generations of workers have worked honorably at this plant, and that goes away today. And these are not just any jobs, these are local jobs. These are good-paying union jobs that have created the middle class right here in Buchanan.
What we were thinking of back in the 1970s, the early years. We were looking forward. Nuclear was a very big deal in the United States at that time, and Indian Point was special.
The shutdown of Indian Point was no accident. It was the result of a coordinated campaign between public agencies and private interests. But at the forefront of this decades-long push stood the environmental NGO sector, with groups like Riverkeeper leading the charge to bring the plant offline.
Nobody has been more important to Riverkeeper than Bobby Kennedy.
Kennedy was an influential part in working to shut down Indian Point.
The agreement to close Indian Point is sort of a capstone for his career here at Riverkeeper. He has put in a tremendous amount of effort on behalf of closing Indian Point and supporting Riverkeeper there. And so I think having achieved this, he thought that perhaps this was a good time to focus on other matters.
Kennedy says the win to close Indian Point was an important milestone for his career. Riverkeeper officials say they will continue their work and do their best to move forward without Kennedy.
To Bobby Kennedy, thank you. I am your biggest fan. I appreciate your great work on the environment and your Riverkeepers organization, which does such a fantastic job.
Riverkeeper was the ringleader amongst a coalition of NGOs that worked in tandem to shut the plant down, including NRDC, Scenic Hudson, and the Hudson River Sloop Clearwater.
We're celebrating the long-fought closure of the Indian Point nuclear power plant.
Indian Point, one of New York's largest nuclear power plants, will begin to shut down in 2020.
Indian Point nuclear power plant has been shut down by the activists in this community.
When we heard that that plant was closing, it was just wonderful. We all celebrated.
Since the announcement of the closure agreement, there's been an increase in renewables and energy efficiency that is going to completely offset the closure of Indian Point.
We don't need Indian Point. Nobody's even going to notice when it goes off.
These groups celebrated victory after the closure of Indian Point, but none had any reaction when the numbers bore out following the closure.
Indian Point is shutting down. That means more fossil fuel.
Indian Point, which had accounted for a quarter of New York City's electricity, was emissionless.
New York's fossil fuel use soared after Indian Point plant closure. Officials sound the alarm.
The rallying call of the environmental movement has been reducing CO2 emissions in the name of saving the planet. But the results of their direct advocacy had caused emissions to go up.
A nuclear plant's closure was hailed as a green win. Then emissions went up.
This begs the question, was it ever about emissions in the first place?
The tragedy of Indian Point. Bowing to anti-nuclear fears, New York chose to shut down a reliable and safe source of energy, and now burns more fossil fuels than before.
And how was such a momentous blunder overlooked?
Autopsy,
of a perfect policy failure, the closure of Indian Point?
The answer lies in a closer examination of our own history. There were several events that happened over the course of the post-World War II era that set the stage for the premature closure of Indian Point.
Those who would keep the river relatively unspoiled glumly watched New York's first nuclear power generating plant go up near Peekskill. Soon they learned of another power plant under consideration, a yet unbuilt one near Cornwall on Storm King Mountain.
Environmental history was made on the Hudson River in many ways. One of the cases that's best known is the Storm King case.
In the 1950s, New York City faced an increasing demand for energy to meet peak usage. New facilities such as Big Alice and Indian Point were constructed to address this need.
Office buildings rear up against the Manhattan skyline. As new residential areas are developed, the demand for more power continues to zoom, and the end is not yet in sight. Nor is there any end in sight for the need to strengthen the vast electric, gas, and steam systems. During the next 5 years, Con Edison will invest more than $1 billion in expansion on new plants such as Indian Point on the Hudson, where the energy of the atom is now harnessed to make more electricity, and Astoria, with a capacity of more than 1.5 million kilowatts.
These plants met baseload energy needs, but the city still required a solution for meeting peak energy demands. Consolidated Edison proposed the Storm King Pumped Storage Project in 1962. The announcement seemed like a straightforward item in New York's ambitious infrastructure plans, as the city was on the constant verge of blackouts. The plant was simple. It would use excess electricity to suck up water from the Hudson River and pump it up to a new reservoir on Storm King Mountain. When electricity was scarce, they would use the power of gravity to let the water drain back out, which would spin turbines that would keep the lights on in New York City. Not only did this plant solve the problem of peak energy demands, but it was an infrastructure project welcomed by the community where the project would be sited.
Con Edison will pay annual taxes of $500,000. With these increased revenues, we shall be able to construct a new village hall, library, village garage, parks, a recreational center, nature trails, and municipal ski slopes.
This would be long-term employment for these men. There are few jobs for men in the area.
Wildlife, game life, and the natural surrounding beauty of the area are fully protected by the plans which are to be implemented in the construction.
The mayor, local labor unions, the Fish and Game Club, multiple congressmen, all supported the project. The Cornwall Local reported that 1,700 people signed a petition in support, with only 100 opposed. The Storm King hydroelectric power plant was virtually perfect. It met the growing power needs of New York City with much-needed peak load energy. It was clean and emissionless. But most of all, because of the economic uplift it would provide, the host community welcomed the plant with open arms. How on earth, then, was the Storm King plant stopped? "5 miles downstream, a part-time resident on the East Bank looked out the front window of his mountain retreat, one of many luxurious second homes in the area. William Osborne, an engineer whose family owned 2,000 acres and a mountainside castle, and who served as president of the Hudson River Conservation Society, realized he would have a clear view of the transmission lines that Con Ed was planning to string across the river to connect the Storm King plant to its circuits in Putnam and Westchester counties. Osborne called a few of his neighbors in similar mountaintop hideaways and found that they too were upset about the plant. which would be visible from several outlooks on the east side of the river. Osborne, whose brother Frederick was a commissioner of the Palisades Interstate Parkway, was soon on the phone to Con Ed to see if it couldn't be persuaded to make a few slight changes in the layout of the plant. At the time, ecology was an obscure discipline found only in a few biology textbooks. Conservation was a movement whose main impetus had occurred around the turn of the century, and environmentalism was a word that didn't even appear in the dictionary. But most people, familiar with the history of the Storm King Mountain controversy, consider William Osborne's phone calls to his mountaintop neighbors as the birth of the environmental movement. The average American citizen has never heard of the Osborne family, a family that shaped the course of both our nation and world history for the worse. William Henry Osborne built his fortune as a railroad tycoon during the 1800s. He and his wife Virginia had two precocious sons, Henry Fairfield and William Church, who came of age with their playmate Teddy Roosevelt, along the gilded estates of the Hudson River Highlands. At the peak of his career, Fairfield Osborne was one of the most famous scientists in America, leading the Museum of Natural History. He also co-founded the American Eugenics Society. He shared, with his friends like Madison Grant, a deep-seated belief in the existence and superiority of distinct human races. In 1916, Madison Grant wrote The Passing of the Great Race. Adolf Hitler considered this book his Bible. Fairfield Osborne wrote the introduction. In 1937, his nephew Frederick praised the Nazi eugenics program as the most important experiment which has ever been tried. It was Frederick's brother, Henry's nephew William Osborne, who kicked off the battle against the Storm King hydroelectric plant. Technically, the environmentalists never defeated the plant in the courts. Over nearly 2 decades of court battling, experts and lawmakers always sided with Consolidated Edison in their bid to build the Storm King hydroelectric plant. It would have provided clean, peak energy to New York City. It would have had a tiny footprint, barely visible from the shoreline. It would have created jobs, recreation space, and was championed by locals, politicians, and unions alike. But it was never built. The environmental movement declared victory in 2 ways. First, they won a war of attrition. Their plan to draw out the court case as long as possible worked. Con Ed ran out of money, and plans were abandoned. More importantly, the case set a new precedent, creating a landmark case and changing the course of American history.
But the court said for the first time in history, after 2 months of litigation, that environmentalists have standing to sue, that citizens can sue to protect a resource if they can show that they hiked on it or they fish in it or they take some kind of a spiritual and aesthetic pleasure from it. They don't actually have to own it. And that case, which and a Storm King doctrine that came out of it, was upheld by the Supreme Court, and it opened the door to environmentalists to come into court and start bringing these lawsuits.
Even Senator Bobby Kennedy Sr. was in favor of both the Storm King plant as well as Indian Point. He was confident that the ecological concerns of both could be resolved, ensuring the plants would be built and a prosperous future could be enjoyed by the residents of the Hudson Highlands.
I cannot believe that our marine biologists are unable to offer assistance in meeting this problem on the Hudson. I cannot believe that a solution to the problems with the Storm King project and the effects of the Indian Point operation cannot be found.
He did not live to see the results of the case. Environmentalism is keen to ignore its older cousin, conservation. The reason for this is quite clear when we examine the direct lineage to the racist, eugenic movement that inspired Hitler. Preserving swaths of untamed wilderness was essential for recreational hunting, which was thought to restore manliness of upper-crust boys who had become soft and effete or over-civilized from modern city life. Preserving wilderness was an important factor for maintaining the quality and hardiness of the chosen people, the Nordic white race. Alexander Saunders, one of the leaders of the opposition and founder of environmental NGO Sloop Clearwater, spoke plainly about his motivation for blocking the Storm King plant.
We don't feel this is the right area for industry. Of course, there are a lot of people on the welfare rolls in Newburgh. But as a businessman, I can tell you, it doesn't represent a very high caliber for a workforce. The ideal land use for this area should be for recreation for people from New York City.
The plant's proximity to the poverty-stricken city of Newburgh would have undoubtedly bolstered the community and provided much-needed economic uplift.
Newburgh grew up alongside the Hudson River, blessed with a beautiful location. But as with so many American cities, the older sections were left to deteriorate, while newer areas were developed. The result is that almost 1/4 of Newburgh is now a slum. This is how City Manager Mitchell interprets it.
People create slums, and there are no second-class citizens except that they want to be second-class citizens and behave like second-class citizens, and our slums have been created by people. In the past 10 years, we have suffered serious economic and social decay. We call it blight in one section of the city. Welfare has acted as a magnet to those who would immigrate into the city. And welfare is a positive factor in slum growth as it attracts the poor rather than repelling them.
The Storm King battle was a landmark case that spawned a mass movement of environmental nonprofits and what might be called the environmental law industrial complex.
About 15 of us gathered in this room and decided to form a committee called the Hudson River Sloop Restoration, Inc., non-profit. And no one knew what it would lead to.
In his 1969 book on the Hudson River, Bob Boyle came up with this idea that there should be a Hudson River keeper. The idea was based on an old British idea, really, where they had river keepers who took care of the private trout and salmon streams for private fishing clubs. While environmental groups are nothing new, the idea of river keepers or bay keepers or sound keepers is very different, absolutely revolutionary. Started right here and is now taught in every environmental law program in the country. It's the Storm King case, famous environmental case.
The Hudson River, a stage for the American Revolution, was now the site of a new revolution. Environmental law and influence on public opinion would shape our nation for the latter half of the 20th century. We have to dive even further back if we want to discover how and when this revolution began to take root. Paul Ehrlich, in his famous 1968 book, The Population Bomb, quotes environmental lawyer Victor Yannicone, suggesting the deep ecology movement must take bold measures to save the world from overpopulation.
In the late 1960s, a new organization, the Environmental Defense Fund, was formed. Its specific purpose, to quote one of its founders, attorney Victor Yannicone, was to sue the bastards, and that is precisely what it has been doing.
Few things have helped turn old conservation activism into the modern environmental movement more than litigation. And there are few people who have been more instrumental in the history of environmental law than Victor Iannacone. Iannacone is a feisty, some might say abrasive, lawyer from Long Island who fought a groundbreaking crusade against the pesticide DDT in the 1960s and helped start the Environmental Defense Fund.
The fight against DDT, a chemical used to control pests, predominantly malaria-carrying mosquitoes, became a rallying call for the neomalthusian movement.
I went into population biology professionally. I did graduate work in entomology at the University of Kansas, and my first assistantship when I first arrived was working on the development of resistance to DDT in fruit flies.
Ehrlich's population bomb gained him notoriety as a household name of the neomalthusian movement. But what most people don't know is that a major influence on a young, college-age Ehrlich was a book called Our Plundered Planet, written by Fairfield Osborne, cousin to William and Frederick Osborne, who had kicked off the Storm King fight. And his father was Henry Fairfield Osborne, a fellow of the Royal Society who co-founded the American Eugenics Society in 1922. What is hard to fathom at this point is how the public was seduced by a movement that was founded by eugenicists to block their own economic development. How did these wolves coax the sheep to aid in the destruction of their own prosperous future? The neo-Malthusian eugenicists knew they had to recruit a specific type of spokesperson, a self-righteous leader of the common man, a plain-clothed, plain-speaking, working-class saint.
I expect to live here till I'm 90. It's the nukes that must go and not me. It's the nukes that must go and not me.
Stopping atomic energy is practicing patriotism.
It's the nukes that must go and not me.
Well, Pete was a great friend, as was Toshi, his wife, who died last year. He lived a very humble life. I met him for the first time in 1984 up in Garrison, New York. He lived in a beacon in a log cabin that he built himself with his own hands, he and Toshi, back in the 1940s. And, you know, in many ways, he had this kind of this Christ-like aspect to him where he dressed in humble clothes. He wandered the banks of the Hudson River with his guitar. You know, we all jumped, those of us who fought for the river for years, we jumped on the moving train that Pete Seeger started moving down the tracks.
Pete Seeger, how'd you get involved in environmental concerns?
It was Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring. I read it in the New Yorker in installments. Up to then, I'd thought the main job to do was help the meek inherit the earth. And that's a job that's got to be done. But I realized if we didn't do something soon, what the meek would inherit would be a pretty poisonous place to live. And so I made almost a 180-degree turn, started reading books like The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, or The Poverty of Power by Barry Commoner. The world's only so big. If that's true, doesn't it follow that the human race is far bigger than it should be? Some things are so big, like this population problem, that the best way to tackle them is in small ways. I can sing a song about overpopulation and maybe touch one or two people at a time with it. I just have to write that song and make it go down easy. That's the key. I'd have to write a funny little song that sneaks the message in, go in through the back door. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 4 is 8. 2 times 8 is 16, and the hour is getting late. We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling. We'll all be a doubling in 42 years. We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling. We'll all be a doubling in 42 years. Twice 16 is 32. Next comes 64. Next comes 128. Do we need to hear more? We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling. We'll all be a doubling in 42 years. We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling. We'll all be a doubling in 42 years. Next comes 256. Next 512. Next 1,024. Figure it out yourself. We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling. We'll all be a doubling in 42 years. We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling. We'll all be a doubling in 42 years. Keep doubling 10 more generations, you can have children more than 1 million. Keep on doubling another 20, your children are over 1 trillion. We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling. We'll all be a doubling in 42 years. We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling. We'll all be a doubling in 42 years. Either people will have to get smaller, or the world's going to have to get bigger. Well, there's a couple other possibilities. Leave it for you to figure. We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling. We'll all be a doubling in 42 years. We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling. We'll all be a doubling in 42 years.
Dedicated to Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who said, "Man has lost the capacity to foresee and forestall. He will end by destroying the earth."
The modern environmental movement, as we know it today, was kicked off in the mid-20th century. A single book claims nearly all of the credit for creating a cultural revolution with massive national and international legal repercussions that have reverberated for well over 50 years. That book is Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson and published in 1962. At surface glance, one might consider the author of Silent Spring a hero for kickstarting the modern environmental movement. But if we dig a little deeper into Carson's history, we will discover a much darker reality. It was renowned British nature writer Henry Williamson and his anthropomorphic books, like Tarka the Otter and Salar the Salmon, that inspired young Carson to become a nature writer. Williamson was a prominent member of Oswald Mosley and Lady Eve Balfour's Soil Association. For the first half of her career, Carson gained acclaim for writing several books on a topic in which she had formal training: the ocean. But in 1962, the marine biologist author suddenly switched gears. Instead of writing about fish in the ocean, her focus changed to invisible, poisonous chemicals and substances that supposedly threatened the very foundations of life. Silent Spring became an explosive bestseller. But how did it come to be? To understand the foundations of the culture-shattering book Silent Spring, we must begin with two affluent Long Island women, Marjorie Spock and Mary Richards. In their early years, they traveled to Dornach, Switzerland, to train at the Goetheanum with the occult leader Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner was an Austrian esoterist, proclaimed clairvoyant, and leader in Helena Blavatsky's Theosophical movement, which he later used as the basis to spin off his own version, anthroposophy. Steiner's spiritual science of anthroposophy was a twisted concoction of German idealist philosophy, theosophy, and Christian Gnosticism. Through anthroposophy, Steiner and his guild founded Waldorf Education and Biodynamic Agriculture, two institutions with a small but powerful influence on our world today. After several years of Steiner's tutelage, Spock and Richards returned to the United States and transferred to the personal guidance of Dr. Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, a close student of Steiner and a key proponent of his teachings. Pfeiffer played a central role in introducing biodynamic farming to America. The post-World War II era saw an explosion in industrial farming methods and scientific breakthroughs, creating food surpluses which condemned Malthusian prognostics to their grave once and for all. or so it may seem. Not everyone rejoiced in this outcome, and the organic farming movement began to take root in reaction to industrial farming. The chemical known as DDT was first used to protect soldiers from malaria and typhus in World War II, and later applied to civilian use, both as disease prevention and as an agricultural bolster. Its benefit to mankind was nothing short of miraculous. Over the summer of 1957, state and federal control planes sprayed Long Island with DDT, which included Spock and Richards' organic garden. Spock and Richards were outraged, claiming their crops were ruined and their soil was totally compromised. Within the esoteric religion of anthroposophy, man-made chemicals are seen as more than just physical threats. They can disrupt the subtle harmony between body, soul, and spirit. Rudolf Steiner's American disciples Marjorie Spock and Mary Richards decided to sue the government.
1957, Murphy versus Benson. This may well be the first modern environmental case brought by citizens, despite the conventional wisdom that the Storm King case started the field. Robert Cushman Murphy, a biologist who was curator emeritus of birds at the American Museum of Natural History, was among a group of property owners who sued the New York Department of Agriculture.
As it turns out, Spock and Richards had very affluent neighbors who happened to be sympathetic to their cause. The high-profile chairman of the Department of Birds at the American Museum of Natural History, Dr. Robert Cushman Murphy, was enlisted not only to help the women, but as the lead plaintiff on the case. It was Henry Fairfield Osborne's nephews who had kicked off the Storm King case, and Robert Cushman Murphy who helmed the DDT case. But the Osborne and Murphy connection is more than mere coincidence. In 1950, Robert Cushman Murphy wrote of the late Osborne.
Upon my daily entry through the first floor of the Roosevelt Memorial Wing of the museum, I pass Joy Buba's bronze portrait of his countenance. Then I salute him not only as the outstanding paleontologist of the golden age of that discipline, as a biologist of magnificent breadth, a seer, philosopher, and friend, but as the great-grandfather of some of my grandchildren.
The two seemingly separate cases, which had laid legal precedent for the American environmental movement of the last 50 years, were steered by colleagues, friends, and family who had been in ideological lockstep. The affluent strain of concerned citizens ran deep. In addition to the anthroposophist women, Murphy persuaded other landowners on Long Island, including Jane Nichols, the granddaughter of financier J.P. Morgan, and Theodore Roosevelt's son, Archibald, to join them as plaintiffs. And from the United Kingdom, the Soil Association sent a $100 check to Spock in support of the campaign.
Murphy versus Benson. In rejecting that claim, the court also stated, it would seem that the plaintiff's major complaint is of annoyance rather than damage.
At first glance, the court case was unsuccessful, overturned as pseudoscientific nonsense. Just like the Storm King case that came after it, the court of law did not find the annoyances of privileged rich people to be reason enough to dismantle the welfare of the general public. But the case laid the groundwork for a deadly cultural shift. Rachel Carson, by this time a respected science writer, caught wind of the court case and pitched it as a serialized story to the New Yorker magazine. With looming doubt over whether the New Yorker gig would materialize, Carson made plans to turn the story into a book. She hired Newsweek science editor Edwin Diamond to co-author. Carson would compose the introduction and conclusion of the book, while Diamond would write the scientifically based meat of the middle. Within 4 months, Diamond quit the project. A year after Silent Spring was published, both in New Yorker magazine and as a best-selling novel, Diamond wrote a damning review.
Thanks to an emotional, alarmist book called Silent Spring, Americans mistakenly believe their world is being poisoned. Silent Spring, it seems to me, stirs the latent demons of paranoia that many men and women must fight down all through their lives.
It was clear Diamond had quit the project based on moral grounds. He wanted no part in a book that would promote pseudoscience, causing fear and paranoia in the general public. This moral objection did not stop Carson. In fact, she seemed quite aware that the book would have cultural implications extending far beyond her lifetime. She told her publisher, Mary Rodell,
I know you have not had my opportunity to visualize the deep significance of the material of tremendous importance in itself, and also meaningful in relation to my broader concern with what life, and especially man, is doing to the environment.
Carson was also well aware that the organic food movement had a poor reputation, and if there was any association with the movement, the book would be dismissed out of hand. In order to sneak her message into the American psyche, Rachel Carson excluded any reference to the organic food movement or anthroposophy in the book Silent Spring, despite the fact that it was the main source for the book's contents.
I am most grateful for all the material you have sent me. I am delighted there is so much sound material. Many thanks for the very excellent Pfeiffer paper with its many references. It is a gold mine of information.
The author of the gold mine paper was Dr. Aaron Fried Pfeiffer, who also appeared as an expert witness in the Long Island spray trial. An entire edition of the U.S. periodical Biodynamics was devoted to Pfeiffer's account. Carson wrote to Spock regularly, with a variety of queries, questions, requests for addresses of contacts, and for copies of articles. Carson frequently expressed her thanks for new material.
Your good letter and enclosures have just arrived, all excellent, helpful, and stimulating. I feel guilty about the mass of your material I have here. You are my chief clipping service, and I do appreciate all you do.
Carson didn't credit the organic movement in Silent Spring because she didn't want to discredit her book. She was tasked with covertly embedding the axioms of organic farming without people's knowledge, smuggling in the organic food agenda to an unsuspecting public.
I'd have to write a funny little song that sneaks the message in, go in through the back door.
We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling, we'll all be a doubling in 42 years. We'll all be a doubling, a doubling, a doubling, we'll all be a doubling in 42 years.
In 1961, I was at the Jackson Hole Research Station in Wyoming, and at that time, Rachel Carson's book was about ready to come out. They had a little excerpt from the book in the New Yorker magazine, which I read at the research station along with everybody else, and we were all impressed at how awful industry was and how wonderful environmentalists were. And I was impressed that way until I got the book that following fall and began to read it. And I got more than halfway through the book before I began to see too many things I just couldn't go along with. And then I made the mistake of trying to check on her facts, and I found that the facts just weren't valid. For example, well, her dedication is to Albert Schweitzer, who, famous African physician, of course, humanitarian. And what she said Albert Schweitzer had said was that man has lost the ability to foresee and forestall. He'll end up destroying the earth. Unfortunately, she implied that this meant that the DDT and other pesticides were going to destroy the earth. So I got Schweitzer's autobiography, and what he says in the autobiography, I can quote exactly. I've used it so many times. He says, what a tremendous amount of harm and labor these wicked insects do cause us. But now, he says, at last, a ray of hope is held out in the form of DDT.
Malaria once plagued America. With the arrival of DDT, it vanished from national memory. But the story did not end there. Today, malaria continues to kill more than 500,000 people every year. Over 90% of those deaths strike Africa. The vast majority are small children. Since 1972, roughly 34 million African children have died from malaria.
Malaria is poverty, essentially. Yeah.
Period. They're synonymous.
Yeah. And those that they die by malaria are the most poor. You are poor, you get malaria, you become more poor. If he has to go to the hospital, he has to pay transport, taxi, buy the medicine. If he's admitted, every day he has to bring somebody food from home. At the end, they are more poor with malaria.
Silent Spring kicked off a national debate about the use of DDT.
At his press conference on August 29, 1962, President Kennedy was asked,
"There appears to be growing concern among scientists as to the possibility of dangerous long-range side effects from the widespread use of DDT and other pesticides. Have you considered asking the Department of Agriculture or the Public Health Service to take a closer look at this?"
Yes, and I know that they already are. I think particularly, of course, since Ms. Carson's book, but they are examining the matter.
The next day, the administration announced that the government pesticide program would be reviewed by the Federal Council on Science and Technology and by a panel of the President's Science Committee.
But the insecticide did not get banned until 1972 under Richard Nixon's newly minted EPA.
The Nixon administration moved today to cut back the use of the pesticide DDT because of a study calling it a health threat.
The attacks on DDT based on Silent Spring and the environmental movement began. And it became a superstition and fear that DDT was a horrible killer, that it was killing fish and killing eagles and other birds of prey, and that it was a cancer-causing agent in human beings.
In 1969, the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society had asked the Secretary of Agriculture to ban DDT, claiming that it did cause cancer.
The Audubon Society spun off a group called the Environmental Defense Fund for the sole purpose of lobbying to ban DDT. The issue finally came to a head in 1972 at hearings at the Environmental Protection Agency.
Victor Yanacone, unpaid counsel for the Environmental Defense Fund, the organization of the anti-DDT scientists.
We will show that DDT is highly toxic to animal and bird species. In addition to direct toxicity, there are indirect effects and sublethal effects, and this may be occurring even in men.
These conclusions are false, and we will bring in expert witnesses in these various fields to demonstrate that these conclusions are false.
Every objection was heard, every risk considered. Yet the overwhelming conclusion was that DDT had transformed the fate of nations. Surgeon General Jesse Leonard Steinfeld put it bluntly.
Although only used as a pesticide since 1939, DDT has been instrumental in literally changing the course of history for many nations and continues to do so today. Its use in the eradication and control of disease has meant the difference between hunger, despair, and poverty, and good health, hope, and the promise of a better life to billions of people throughout the world. DDT has been responsible for returning to man the use of agriculturally rich lands, thereby making possible improvements in nutrition, providing in turn the energy and strength for social and economic development. It has had a tremendous impact on the health of the world, and few drugs can claim to have done so much for mankind in so short a period of time as can DDT.
The scientific community said it should not be banned. The committee that the EPA had advising them said it should not be banned.
At the end of the testimony, the administrative law judge, Edmund Sweeney, ruled that DDT should not be banned because the facts did not show that DDT was a threat to human health or the environment. His decision was overruled by the EPA Administrator William Ruckelshaus.
The Environmental Protection Agency today banned almost all domestic use of the pesticide DDT by the 31st of December.
Now, in 1970, the National Audubon Society distributed 17,000 yellow leaflets. The message was, quote, DDT should be banned throughout the land and banned from export. They knew that it was being used overseas to control malaria.
80% of American production of DDT is used overseas, much of it in American foreign aid program. The effect of any very severe restriction or ban of DDT in this country would be disastrous on these countries that are now using DDT for public health.
By the time DDT was banned in the United States, malaria had already been wiped out. The same was not true for the developing world. Unfortunately, the fact that the Western world had made a supposedly scientific determination on the use of the chemical, it set the terms for the rest of the world. In hindsight, revisiting the sentiments of the environmental movement at the time, this may have been the point. Dr. Charles Wooster, former chief scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund, was once asked if he thought a ban on DDT might result in the use of more dangerous chemicals and more malaria cases in Sri Lanka. He replied,
"Probably. So what? People are the cause of all the problems. We have too many of them. We need to get rid of some of them, and this is as good a way as any. If the environmentalists can win on DDT, they will achieve a level of authority they have never had before. In a sense, then, much more is at stake than DDT."
My own doubts came when DDT was introduced for civilian use. In Guyana, within 2 years, it had almost eliminated malaria, but at the same time, the birth rate had doubled. So my chief quarrel with DDT in hindsight is that it has greatly added to the population problem.
DDT was not banned under JFK, but with Carson, a pernicious seed was embedded deep within the Kennedy family.
Well, Rachel Carson became adopted as one of these auxiliary members of the Kennedy family.
Rose Kennedy had her children read Silent Spring, and almost religious reverence for nature was implanted with the Catholic family. Douglas Brinkley refers to a baptism on Thoreau's Walden Pond.
Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s fondest childhood memories are Rachel Carson coming there and talking about the ecology and the natural world, and it launched his career as an environmental lawyer.
Much like a young Carson, Bobby Kennedy Jr. was enamored with the natural world. His uncle, President Kennedy, arranged for young Bobby to have an interview with his Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall. Udall, who continued to serve under Johnson after JFK's assassination, was a major proponent of the emerging environmental movement of the 1960s.
I believe that we have reached a point in our history when from now on, restraint in what we do with our machines and our technology, the way that we live, in other words, that maybe Thoreau was right and that we must return to simplicity and restraint. But of course this runs counter, it runs across the grain of all of American thinking. The American outlook, the thing that has dominated the American mind, as we know, has been conquest, the conquest of new frontiers.
On the new frontier of science and space.
We've had some silly talk as part of the space program about colonizing the planets. And always the idea that has dominated us has been what one might call growth mania, that all growth is good. Limits and restraint must be the keynote of man's activities. We do have indeed a very crucial world population problem, so let's be honest about it and face up to that. Nature's trying to say something to us. It's trying to say that there is a carrying capacity, or should be of some kind, in Southern California, just as there should be a carrying capacity in East Pakistan or in other parts of the world. But it means we have to change our value system, we have to change direction, we have to change our institutions in this country. The environment movement, among other things, is a value revolution.
Absolutely revolutionary. Started right here and is now taught in every environmental law program in the country. It's the Storm King case.
I think that the best thinking that's coming from the campuses in this country is a questioning of values. I think it's high time we questioned them. What environmentalists are now suggesting means not only that people must continue, as they're doing all over this country, to fight progress. They ask you where the battle line is in the environment today, people are fighting progress. You know, they're fighting dams and electric power plants they think are in the wrong place. They're fighting chemical plants that want to edge into the seacoast. They're fighting freeways. The very things that to my generation have been the symbols of progress, you know, great, here comes a road, somebody's going to build a dam. People are fighting these things. I happen to be on the National Board of the Environmental Defense Fund, which started out fighting the battle against DDT. In the last year, we won 3 or 4 really startling law cases, you know, setting a whole new basis for what people can and can't do, or even what governments can't do. I think we need more scientists like Barry Commoner and Paul Ehrlich. The speeches most of us gave on campuses last year, people like Barry Commoner and the rest of us, were essentially trying to sell the idea of ecology.
These were the figures that shaped young Robert Kennedy Jr. after both his father and uncle were murdered. The New Frontier may have been the theme of JFK's nomination speech.
The new frontier is here, whether we seek it or not.
But young RFK Jr. began his career in the spotlight with a documentary in Africa called The Last Frontier.
Join Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in Africa, The Last Frontier, today at 5.
The film, directed by Roger Ailes, features 18-year-old Bobby Kennedy Jr., along with British ecologist and patron of London-based Population Matters, Norman Myers, discussing conservation prospects for African wildlife.
In 1973, I think. What were you, 19 or 20, I guess?
Yeah. Roger and I spent 6 weeks in a tent together.
That's right. We spent 6 weeks and we had some great nights sitting around the campfire over in Africa. Lem and I hitting a little scotch and talking about your great future, and here you are, all these years later.
I think that's the point Rachel Carson was making. They were spraying the DDT on to try to get the fire ants or the gypsy moths, but it was getting into the food chain, and it was bioaccumulating, and it was getting into us. We're not worried whether the striped bass in the Hudson River have PCBs in them. We're worried that those PCBs are going to get into children. If you want to look at what would happen to nations, to our country, if we didn't invest in the environment, look at the nations that didn't do it in 1970. We started in 1970 investing in environmental infrastructure. Russia didn't do that. China didn't do that. Eastern Europe didn't do it. Mexico didn't do it. And now you have in those nations, you have environmental catastrophes that have matured into economic catastrophes. And there's entire regions of those nations that simply cannot be regenerated economically. They are write-offs. And what we're saying is, we have a duty to prosper. Every generation has a duty to use the resources that God gave us to prosper. But we don't have the right to use resources that belong to the next generation. We have to maintain their choices intact for that generation.
Examining Bobby's rhetoric becomes a minefield of contradiction. The most essential question worth asking, who's this all for?
Well, my view is that that we're not protecting the environment for nature's sake. We're protecting it for the sake of humanity. We're not protecting those northern forests for the sake of a spotted owl. We're protecting those forests because we believe they have more value to humanity standing than they would have where they cut down.
Who is Bobby trying to save? The children? The spotted owls? The forest? For its own sake?
The battle over the spotted owl was a symbolic one. We used the spotted owl because we wanted to save those forests. We weren't saving those forests for the sake of a spotted owl, but the spotted owl was the only hook that the environmentalists had in order to preserve a publicly owned resource. But the point is, we weren't preserving that old-growth forest for the sake of the spotted owl. We're preserving the old-growth forest for its own sake and using the spotted owl as a tool.
It begs the question, should trees have standing? In 1957, the first environmental case was waged by anthroposophists and eugenicists against the United States government. The 1962 book based on the case led to the eventual ban on DDT and the preventable massacre of African children by volumes that would make Hitler blush. By 1972, the book, Should Trees Have Standing?, for the first time, suggested that nature itself can and should have legal protection. The environmental law industrial complex was in full motion, and by the late 1990s, they had cultivated a young, handsome Kennedy as the heroic leader of their movement. Over his 30-year career as an environmental lawyer, he prevented mega infrastructure projects from being built on almost every continent. As his participation in larger media spectacles grew, his rhetoric became increasingly bombastic.
We're willing to accept, many people up here are willing to accept a concept of enforced ruralization. You know, like the corporate hog farms, etc., who've done tremendous damage to this country and to quality of life all over this country. 80% of Republicans are just Democrats who don't know what's going on. Then the White House ripped the heart and soul out of the Clean Air Act. That single decision kills 24,000 Americans every year. 8 times the number of people who were killed in the World Trade Center attack. If you're an American and you want to hear the voice of God, you have to go into the forest and listen to the songs of the birds and the rustle of the leaves. And if you want to see the American soul, you have to look into the mirror of Walden Pond. The explosive power every week in the coal fields of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, that is the equivalent of a Hiroshima bomb.
Coal could not survive for a minute. It's the most catastrophically expensive way to boil a pot of water that's ever been devised.
Fox News can't go to Canada. It's illegal to lie on the air in Canada. So Fox News can't go there. In the 1500s in England, it was illegal to add a Clean Air Act, and it was illegal to burn coal and furnaces, and it was a capital crime, and people were executed for it. The addiction to carbon is destroying the values that make us proud to be American. Because of our addiction to oil and to carbon, funding both sides of the war against terror. The solution is to get off of oil in this country. You need to turn every American into an energy entrepreneur, every home into a power plant. Saying that global warming doesn't exist, that they are contemptible human beings, and that, I wish that there were a law you could punish them under. This is a project that is going to enrich a few billionaires by impoverished, like Donald Trump. How are we going to transition off of dinosaur, dangerous fuel, addictive fuels from hell to the green, clean, wholesome, and patriotic fuels from heaven?
Global warming is real, and we've got to do something. There are many people who are now beginning to change their opinions because Mother Nature is the fat lady singing. We're going to win. How long will it take? Well, Martin Luther King Jr. once said, how long? Not long, because no lie can live forever.
Was Rachel Carson embedded within the Kennedy family, tasked with a mission to corrupt from within? It's stark and sobering to realize that Robert Kennedy Jr. has spent his career protesting the same infrastructure his uncle, our 35th president, was promoting up until the moment he was assassinated.
Then on to the business at hand, the dedication of the huge Ohi Reservoir Dam, the largest earth-rolled dam in the world. The project is a revolutionary means of flood control, conservation, and power generation.
So the only way that the carbon cronies can keep their domination in the marketplace is by constructing a lot of infrastructure. And of course, we're not going to buy it in this country because we're going to be switching to wind and solar and electric cars.
In the last year of his life, John Fitzgerald Kennedy toured the United States, inspiring Americans around the same ideals our country was founded on: growth, development of natural resources, and cooperation that services mankind now and propels him into the future, not just for one region, but the nation as a whole, and the entire global community as one mankind.
First, we must maintain an aggressive program to use our hydro resources to the fullest. Every drop of water which goes to the ocean without being used for power or used to grow or being made available on the widest possible base is a waste. And I hope that we will do everything we can to make sure that nothing runs to the ocean unused and wasted. In these ways, Whiskey Town Reservoir and the Trinity Division will add to our natural beauty and will show that man can improve on nature. This section of the United States, of course, the key is water. And unless we organize every drop to be of service to mankind, this state is going to stand still. You can't possibly grow. Once the water level remains the same, once the amount of water you have for use for irrigation and reclamation and power remains the same, this state stands still. So water is the key. The management of water, I think, is the key that will open a very bright future. This demonstrates our confidence in the future. And we will find by concentrating our energy on our national resources, on conserving them, but not merely conserving and saving them, but by developing and improving them, the United States will be richer and stronger. Less than 30 years ago, in the lifetime of most of us here, as you know, fewer than 10% of all our rural homes in this country had electric power. Whenever I read about the statistics of desolation that are in the underdeveloped world in Latin America and all the rest, we should realize that less than 30 years ago, only 10% of our rural homes had electricity. That's how quickly the face of a nation can be changed, by determination and by cooperative action by all the people. Then, a farmer had no opportunity to participate in the mainstream of American life, to use labor-saving machinery. We cannot prevent other people in this country from developing their resources. We look forward to the day when energy will flow where it's needed. And those who say that its job is finished, and the job really in so many ways of this country finished, are wrong. By the end of this century, we're going to have 300 million people and a $2 trillion national income, and a great responsibility as the food basket of a world which will double its population in the next 40 years. This is the prospect for the end of this century. And the key to this century is power. Power on the farm as well as the factory. Power in the country as well as the city. And the need for power on the farm and the countryside continues to grow. Electricity rates must remain low. More generating capacity must be developed. And soon the vast resources of nuclear energy will be tapped.
President John F. Kennedy declared himself a warrior in the fight against an energy empire. For this, he was murdered. In part 1, we saw how geopolitical tensions forced Cuba to cope with the loss of synthetic fertilizers and modern farming methods in a desperate effort to maintain their sovereignty.
Cuba had committed to the Green Revolution, a system which requires the massive use of fossil fuels in the form of natural gas-based fertilizers, oil-based pesticides, and diesel fuel for tractors and other farm machinery. The country's agriculture was more industrialized than any other Latin American country and exceeded the U.S. in its use of fertilizer.
After the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba's largest trading partner, the island nation went from being an industrial powerhouse to the special period.
A drastic effort to convert every piece of arable land to organic agriculture was begun. Without fossil fuels, more manual labor was needed, making smaller farms necessary and increasing the number of farmers.
We saw how Americans of the same generation were culturally infiltrated and brainwashed to willingly embrace the pseudoscientific and mystical indoctrination into organic farming.
Biodynamic techniques involve preparations prescribed by Rudolf Steiner. On the fall equinox, manure is put into cows' horns and buried for 6 months. Other preparations involve stuffing chamomile into a cow's small intestine, wrapping dandelion in a cow's mesentery, and filling a cow's skull with oak bark.
When we are using those preparations, enabling the earth in a way to begin to heal and balance itself. But it is only the human being that would have the consciousness to bring those materials together in that way and immerse them in the earth in relation to the cosmic streams, and then bring them back out as a gift towards healing in nature.
Ultimately, it was U.S. leadership that strong-armed Cuba, forcing the island nation to become a laboratory experiment for what would happen if fossil fuels were to suddenly become unavailable.
What we've discovered is that Cuba, because their own artificial peak oil was imposed on them when the Soviet Union collapsed, is actually a model for what's going to take place in the rest of the world.
Showing Cubans that potential now is important to try and preserve the island's unique farming methods.
The United States hopes to learn from the Cubans' experience with organic production. The USDA and Cuban Agriculture Ministry signed an agreement during Obama's visit last week that included calls for sharing information and research on organic farming practices.
In reality, Cuba had become a laboratory experiment for climate cultists to run models on a subjected population to see how they might adapt to forced energy austerity.
We need some sort of laboratory experiment where we can run this and see, what's the best way to do it, what's not so good, and so on. And Cuba provides us with that because Cuba has already undergone a kind of energy famine.
Cuba's energy famine, known as the Special Period, happened just as a young Robert Kennedy Jr.'s star was rising in the world of environmental law. In fact, he played a major role in the course of Cuba's energy history.
Robert Kennedy Jr. and Michael Kennedy met with Cuban President Fidel Castro, the man who was their uncle's most bitter Cold War enemy. The Kennedys were in Cuba last week as part of a delegation of American energy experts and environmental safety advocates. Robert Kennedy Jr. is joining me now. He is senior staff attorney for the Washington-based Natural Resources Defense Council.
I work for a couple of environmental groups. I'm a senior staff attorney at NRDC, and we've done a number of energy projects throughout the Americas. This is a hot issue now, particularly in South Florida and the Gulf states, because Castro is planning to build, or has already almost completed construction of a nuclear power plant that's a Soviet-designed power plant, which gives people a lot of concern.
In 1976, Cuba signed an agreement with the Soviet Union to construct the Jaragua nuclear power plant, consisting of two 444 megawatt reactors, utilizing the VVR design, a more advanced and safer design than Chernobyl used. The plant was slated to deliver 15% of Cuba's energy upon completion and reduce its dependence on foreign oil. Construction began in 1983 and was scheduled to be operational by 1993. Though the plant was near completion, in 1992, the collapse of Cuba's Soviet allies forced an indefinite halt to the project. In 1996, the NRDC, together with Citizens Energy Corporation, an NGO based out of Massachusetts, founded by RFK's older brother Joseph, organized a U.S. delegation to Cuba, which included both RFK Jr. and his brother Michael, to discuss Cuba's energy needs and urge Castro to abandon his nuclear program.
We went down there with a group from NRDC and my brother's company, which is an alternative energy company.
Out of Boston.
That's right. We went down there first to look at the safety of the reactor and their plans for making it safe. And secondly, to look at their other energy resources, the indigenous energy resources in Cuba. What we found is that all of the biomass that is left over, the waste product that is left over from creating sugar, the sugar cane essentially, is burned or thrown away. If you burn that cane in high-efficiency turbines, that you could provide all of the energy needs for Cuba for this foreseeable future. You could do it at a fraction of the price that they're putting into this nuclear power plant, and you could do it on the same timelines.
Was Castro interested in any of this when you sat down to meet with him?
He was very interested in it. What he essentially said is, look, we've sunk $1.5 billion into this plant. It's almost built. We need to put $700 million more into it to complete it. And what we said is, if you spent that $700 million, instead of spending it on the nuclear plant, if you spent it buying gas turbines and putting those, or high-efficiency turbines, putting them into your sugar plants, you can get the energy just as fast. And he said, if I can figure out a way to do that, I will. Essentially, that's what he was saying to us. He said, every public statement before we went in there, he had said, I am irrevocably committed to the construction of this nuclear power plant. While we were in there, he said to us, I'm very persuaded by your arguments. My major problem is financing, because the Soviets are going to give me a lot of this money, and if I could figure out a way to get that money some other way, or to buy the turbines, this is something that we would like to consider. It's a real problem for the United States, I believe, to have that nuke plant in Cuba.
Robert Kennedy Jr. convinced the Cubans. He claimed that by burning the byproduct of their staple commodity, sugarcane, they could abandon plans to build the Joragua nuclear power plant and save money. But without their largest trading partner and the longest embargo in history, the sugarcane industry collapsed. Despite the fact that there are thousands of biogas digesters in Cuba, they contribute less than 1% of total national electric generation, about 10 to 20 megawatts. Joragua would have provided 880 megawatts, or about 20% of the nation's baseload energy. As a result, not only has the island become more dependent on fuel imports, but it faces constant and increasing blackouts.
We start in Cuba, where a power grid collapse triggered a nationwide blackout. Cuban officials said failures at a substation in Havana Friday evening began a chain reaction that completely shut down power generation across the island. More than 10 million people were without power for days, until power was gradually restored starting in Havana, Cuba's capital, Sunday night. The nationwide power outage is the fourth major loss of power in only 6 months. For nearly a week in October last year, most of Cuba suffered near total blackouts, making it the worst energy outage in decades. This event is the latest in a series of failures for the island, struggling with aging infrastructure, natural disasters, and economic uncertainty.
The Cuban government points to the U.S.'s 62-year-old embargo as the reason for its economic problems, which have resulted in the blackouts. But American officials say it is Cuba's long-term mismanagement of resources and economic policy that have increased hardship on the island's citizens.
According to Western news outlets, Cuba's failure is due to their own bad policy and resource management, not the half-century-long embargo and the imposition by Obama liberals to strong-arm Cuba into organic farming methods. In 1996, Robert Kennedy Jr. boasted loudly that Castro capitulated to him, abandoning the nearly completed Joragua nuclear power plant. Does Kennedy now claim any responsibility for Cuba's chronic blackouts? The hard reality is that it's never been about energy, or the environment, or the well-being of our fellow man. It's a political game, a game that cares for none of the above, a game where you can lie, cheat, and steal in order to win.
I've been involved in politics all my life, and I love politics. Politics is what I do now, as an environmentalist, but in terms of electoral office, I feel very comfortable doing all the things you need to do to get to electoral office.
In fact, after winning office in 2008, Barack Obama had strongly considered RFK Jr. to head the EPA. But it wasn't quite time yet for Bobby.
Now, any comment you want to make on possibility of heading up the EPA?
I'm going to try to help in any way that I can. The Obama administration, I think everybody in the environmental community is very excited about this new president. I don't think I'm going to be able to take that job this time around, just because I've got a lot of young kids still. So I think I have to wait for a couple of years before I go into the government.
But you haven't heard the call yet. You haven't heard the call. You haven't heard.
I haven't seen the opportunity that I want has not opened for me, and I really love what I'm doing, and so I don't see any reason to go, and I feel like I'm very effective in what I do, and I just don't see any reason to stop doing that.
Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Come back soon. We'll follow what happens with the nuclear project in Cuba and what you're doing for rivers and lakes and water in New York State.
In part 2, we examined the economic sabotage of Sri Lanka and Vandana Shiva's key role in using organic food as a weapon.
Food is a weapon. When you sell real weapons and arms, you control armies. When you control food, you control society.
And that's where Vandana Shiva has done a great damage, because she's not blocking many of the innovations in America. She comes and gives a lecture and makes $100,000 in many of our universities, but our public policy is not much impacted by her. But what is happening is, unfortunately, many of the policymakers in countries such as in Uganda or Philippines have listened to her and have implemented policy to their own detriment. They are literally shooting in their own foot by listening to people like Vandana Shiva. Of course, our biggest noticeable impact has been in Sri Lanka, where the president of Sri Lanka very stupidly decided to ban all modern chemical inputs into farming and send Sri Lanka into a tailspin of economic catastrophe, where a country that was almost like a medium-income country is now starving.
We saw how Shiva's sophistry fit hand in glove with the ego-imperialist agenda of King Charles, not to mention the very close and special relationship the two share.
He is a monarch of a different kind. He's a monarch of a peaceful earth.
Yeah, well, Vandana Shiva is another person for whom I have the most enormous admiration, because she has battled heroically, I think, in India and elsewhere.
I think it has been very, very carefully developed that Prince Charles should be made to look like he's some kind of a loony on the fringe, only because his ideas are so sane in an insane world. The insane world would like to maintain its insanity.
Vandana Shiva and King Charles are in ideological lockstep. They believe the world needs to degrow in order to combat climate change.
I call climate change the metabolic disease of the planet.
With a growing global population creating ever-increasing demand on the planet's finite resources, economic growth alongside unsustainable population growth is today one of the most powerful drivers behind a range of disturbing ecological trends.
But they are not alone.
The role he's playing behind the scenes and putting people together, at creating coalitions that start to work on a different plane, is an extremely different role.
If one thing is certain, it's that Robert Kennedy Jr. is a major player in Vandana Shiva's coalition.
First of all, let me introduce you. This is my hero, Vandana Shiva, who I've known for many, many years, who has been a role model for me, really. She's about 40 IQ points smarter than I am.
It is, as the subtitle says, my life in a biodiversity of movements, including our work together in water keepers and our work together on the GMO question, the glyphosate question. I remember the last time we met was at the Heirloom Expo when you were fighting the case on glyphosate and winning each case.
And I think that's why I want to really thank Bobby, that not only is he taking up the issue of the legal cases, but is shaping the imagination of the crime. Because it's only when we wake up to the fact that the dominant economy and the dominant fictitious science of post-facts and alternative facts, long before Trump, Monsanto was doing it. Long before Trump, Monsanto was doing it. And I really feel we have to recognize this as the biggest crime, recognize our power in different ways to both expose the crime, make them accountable, and shape another future.
If we can heal this crisis of perception, then it seems to me that everything else we need to do will become so much easier.
What needs to be done? The grim answer, which played out a century ago in Hitler's Germany, is to reduce the human population. Genocide of the 20th century took place under the guise of science, formerly known as eugenics. The pseudoscience of eugenics proved to be very popular with Anglophile elites in America, who were rightfully ashamed after the results of their science bore out as the Nazi Holocaust of World War II. Frederick Osborne, who once praised the Nazi eugenics program as the most important experiment which has ever been tried, didn't give up his commitment to eugenics after the war. Instead, he called for a rebranding. In his 1968 book, The Future of Human Heredity, An Introduction to Eugenics in Modern Society, he wrote, "Eugenic goals are most likely to be attained under a name other than eugenics." As the Cold War climate set in, the wolves in sheep's clothing found fertile ground for a new battle. A new era of paranoia set the stage as a direct front against the human intellectual mind.
And the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
Sophists set out to destroy the Christian conception of all mankind made in the image of his creator. Human life was dragged down to the level of all other matter on the planet, no better than the beast.
It is like a war against our gut microbiome, which is 90% of us in terms of biodiversity. We are 10% human. 90% are the beings who keep us healthy, who make us, and the war against our bodies.
To sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
In order for the poison pill to be swallowed, new religions, or you could even say a revival of old pagan religions and occult beliefs, blossomed in the age of Aquarius.
The earth is a living organism. She is called Gaia.
Malthusian occultists placed industrial society directly in their crosshairs.
First industrial revolution, textiles. Gandhi pulls out the spinning wheel. Second industrial revolution was chemicals. And Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, and we got the environmental movement.
For more than half a century, industrial farming methods based on chemistry instead of biology have prevailed, upsetting the harmonious balance of nature, degrading soils. Of course, Rudolf Steiner was one of the first people to recognize the interconnectedness of soil fertility and the vital health of plants, animals, and people.
The sad reality is that Robert Kennedy Jr.'s ideological lineage stems all the way back from Shiva and the King of England to Malthus himself.
We recognize if we're going to make America healthy again, we have to have a partner with agriculture in this country. We cannot produce food for our country, high quality food, making sure that our farms is sustainable.
A strange pattern emerges if we study our own American history. Our founding fathers, including Hamilton, Franklin, Washington, and Adams, laid the framework for a republic based on an economic system, an industrial powerhouse of national sovereignty that would expand the rights of every individual internally and across the entire world. The American system was explicitly against the energy empire.
Two systems are before the world. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism. The other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks towards universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system. The other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world.
Is it a coincidence that every single leader who has supported the American system, an economic program of international peace and industrial development, has been shot at, most of them successfully assassinated? Robert Kennedy Jr. had spent the greater part of his career in opposition to Trump, specifically as an environmental activist opposed to development. At the very end of the election cycle, RFK Jr. rebranded himself as a Trump supporter and now finds himself within the cabinet, overseeing health, which plays out as food and medicine. One has to ask, is RFK playing the same role in the Trump administration that Rachel Carson played in JFK's? Only time will tell. The slogan, "Make America Great Again," implies that we have been great in the past. And it's true. America was a great nation. But most American citizens forgot exactly what it was that made us great in the first place. One could look at the 20th century as the largest experiment of cultural amnesia ever executed. What does it mean to be American? Even a half-century after we declared our independence from Britain, we were called on to remember what made our country great, what gave us the right to exist in the first place. John Quincy Adams reminded us that the first step was breaking away from England and declaring our independence from an empire of conquest, an empire with a degenerated view of mankind. He reminded us that America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all, which can only be done by leading by example. He warned that once America enlists in geopolitical struggles, no matter how well-intentioned, that she would no longer be a beacon of freedom and independence for all mankind. The frontlet upon her brow would no longer beam with the ineffable splendor of freedom and independence, but in its stead would soon be substituted an imperial diadem, flashing in false and tarnished luster the murky radiance of dominion and power. She might become the dictatress of the world, and she would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit.